If you had been alive in the late 1940s or the 1950s, and let's say that you were 30 years old, 40 years old, maybe 50 years old. If you were old enough, that is, to have lived through World War I and World War II, you could have been forgiven for asking yourself, okay, when is World War III going to happen? Because once you start numbering things, by the way, World War I was not called World War I until there was a World War II. And before then, it was just called the Great War. But then along comes an even greater war, so they start numbering them. And so once you get to World War I and then World War II, well, the natural thing is to ask yourself, when's World War III going to happen? Because, well, World War I was in the 1910s, World War II started in the late 1930s, so seems like we'll be lucky if we survive a generation without a World War III. And in fact, as the Cold War emerged between the United States and the Soviet Union, with this tension between the great powers of the earth, there were all sorts of people who really were bracing for World War III. And when you throw in the tensions that arose from the struggles of people in Africa and Asia to gain independence of the colonial powers, then there were all sorts of elements. And then there was a revolution, a civil war in China that threatened to bring in other people. So World War III seemed like it was just going to come around the bend. There were people who had fought in World War II, actually World War I and World War II, who at the time of the various crises in Europe in the post-war period, began to think, okay, we better brace for it because World War III is coming now. But it didn't happen. And here we are, 75 years after the end of World War II, and World War III has not happened. Now, I always have to say, has not happened yet. I don't think it's going to happen tomorrow, but if World War III should happen 5 years from now, then this question that I'm asking, why no World War III, is going to take a very different form, because at that point, why did it take so long to get to World War III? So the question, though, that we have to ask, there hasn't been a World War III yet, so it's fair to ask, why not? And some of this gets to the question of, well, it's a really basic question of human existence and the way sort of humans are, of human nature. And the question is this: are humans basically peaceful or basically warlike? If you think they're basically peaceful, then the thing you have to explain is, why do wars happen? Because it would seem, under this view, that the default setting of human existence is peace. War is the strange thing. War is the anomaly. War is the thing that has to be explained. On the other hand, if you think that humans are cussed creatures, they're basically warlike, then you'd expect people to be at war, and you'd have to explain why there sometimes is peace. Now, one could imagine that under this view, you wouldn't expect there to be constant war. You have to sort of rest up after a while, and you have to rebuild your military and all that other stuff. But you'd expect wars to be happening pretty frequently. So, the question, and it's a question of that each individual can answer for himself or herself, because it goes to your interpretation of what kind of beings humans are. Are humans basically belligerent, warlike, or are humans basically peaceful? Do humans mostly want to be at peace? Do they want to be nice to their neighbors? Or do they want to be hateful? Do they want to be mean? Do they want to find enemies and beat up on the enemies? So this is a question that every human can ask and answer. It's actually, and every citizen of a country like the United States should ask this, because the United States has been involved in a bunch of wars in its existence. Oh, by the way, when I said, why no World War III, this doesn't mean the United States has not been at war. The United States has gone to war several times since World War II. The United States went to war in Korea in the 1950s, and Vietnam in the 1960s and 70s, and the Persian Gulf in 1991, and in Afghanistan and Iraq after the beginning of the 21st century. So it's not as though there haven't been any wars, just a really big war, a world war. So where the great powers of the world are basically going all out against each other. That was what happened in World War I. That's what happened in World War II. but it hasn't happened since. So the question is, why not? And I posed this deeper question: are humans basically peaceful or basically warlike? And how people have answered that over time has depended sort of often on when in time you ask the question. So imagine that you were alive, that you were an adult, maybe an elderly adult. You'd seen a lot of life in the year 1815. 1815, I choose that date because it is at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, a series of wars that began when Napoleon became the leader of France and lasted for the first 15 years of the 19th century. But the Napoleonic Wars followed from the wars of the French Revolution, which followed from the wars of empire that dated back to the 17th century. So from the late 1600s until the early 1800s, Europe, and I'll focus on Europe here, Europe had been almost constantly at war, or at least, there was a war and then there might be a break for 8 or 10 years, and then there's another war and then another break and then another war, and it's almost hard to count them up. They have names that vary depending on who's doing the naming, but really from the 1690s until 1815, we'll take 1815. If you had been alive during much of that period and you've been a student of history or something, you pretty naturally would have concluded that the basic setting of human nature was war, because countries seem to be at war all the time. And so, of that basic question, are humans basically warlike or basically peaceful? You would have been well placed to say humans are basically warlike. And then you might very well have expected there are going to be more wars. But your expectations would have been wrong, because between 1815 and 1914, Europe was largely at peace. There were a couple of kind of mid-level wars, but nothing like the great wars of the French Revolution and of the Napoleonic era. And so let's say you were the grandson of the granddaughter of that person who in 1815 had concluded that humans were basically warlike. If the question were posed to you in, say, 1913, there have been 98 years, essentially, of peace in Europe. You might very well have said, humans are basically peaceful. Or maybe you would have said, humans have become peaceful. So maybe in those bad old days, humans were basically warlike, but now in this modern era, we figured it out and we don't go to war. In fact, there was an entire theory of political development that said that there would be no more great wars because the economies of the different European countries had become so integrated that the Germans were the best customers of the French, and the French were good customers of the Russians and the English and everybody else. And so the economies of Europe were so tied together that it would have been economic foolishness to go to war. You don't go to war with your best customers. You don't go to war with your principal suppliers. So a version of this theory was, back in the old days, back in Grandpappy's day, humans might have been basically warlike, but we've learned to be peaceful. And you could have fit this in with other things. So in the bad old days, societies committed, human sacrifice. And from a perspective of 1913, you said in the bad old days, humans practiced slavery. Those bad practices are gone, and humans have evolved maybe to a higher plane, or we've just gotten smarter or something, and we don't do that bad old stuff anymore, and we don't do war anymore. So that would have been a perfectly reasonable response to the question, are humans basically warlike or basically peaceful, if posed to someone in 1913? Well, then along comes 1914 and World War I, which was, at that time, the worst war in human history. Millions of people were killed. And at the end of World War I, in 1918, 1919, in the years after the war, you might very well have said, okay, well, I don't know if humans are basically warlike or basically peaceful. We were warlike and then we were peaceful for a long time, and now we had this one war, but maybe we learned our lesson and we're not going to do it again. Sometimes it takes that kind of thing to smack some sense into your head. But then, just 20 years after the end of World War I comes World War II, which is even worse than World War I. So, if the question had been posed to you, let's say you're the daughter or son of the person who answered the question in 1913, and the question is posed to you in, let's say, 1948. Are humans basically peaceful or basically warlike? You just look on the previous 25 years and you would say, oh my God, they're horribly warlike. And, we'll certainly pray that World War III is delayed for a while, but it probably won't be permanently delayed. And when it happens, probably civilization as a whole, society as a whole, is just going to come crashing down because World War II was so damaging. So, anyway, there is this basic question, and the question is still a valid question today because here we are, 75 years away from World War II, and there hasn't been a World War III. So, the question I pose to you is, are humans basically warlike or basically peaceful? And since we haven't had a world war since 1945, you might say, basically peaceful. And yeah, we screw up every now and then, and they're bad actors, and somebody gets, bent out of shape and there's a war, but it doesn't blow up the way World War I and World War II blew up. So this is where we are. So one way of getting at the question is, what is human nature? But then human nature, humans live in contexts, in historical contexts, and political, societal contexts. So it's one answer to the question might be that humans have become peaceful, maybe. Maybe it took 2 world wars for them to learn their lesson. That's a possibility. But it's also quite possible that there are other things going on. Oh, actually, and so one of the reasons that the question is important is not in simply understanding the past, but trying to figure out the future. Because anybody who is 18 years old today, 20 years old today, you're going to be a citizen of the United States. You're going to be a citizen probably for another 50, 60 years. And during that time, you will, one by one and then collectively, make decisions that will determine whether the United States goes to war or not. It's not going to be all on you, but you're going to be a big part of this. And if you conclude that humans are basically peaceful, then you might very well vote in a way that tends to bring out the peaceful character of humans, Americans and other people. On the other hand, if you think that humans are basically warlike, well, you're going to think that war's bound to come, so you might as well get in the first blow. So, this is of importance for the future. So therefore, it's all the more important to try to dissect so why there hasn't been a World War III. Again, one possibility is human nature has something to do with it, but has human nature changed 3 times in the last 200 years? It's not out of the question, but maybe it's not too likely. So maybe other things have been going on. Maybe other things went on to bring on those wars. But let's just consider what has happened since World War II. And what might have occurred that prevented, or at least postponed, World War III. Now, if the question were posed to theorists of international relations, these are people who make a profession of trying to answer these sorts of questions, the answer that would come up most commonly, especially during the era of the Cold War, this period of tension between the United States and the Soviet Union that lasted from the second half of the 1940s to the first part of the 1990s, basically a 45-year period, when the United States and the Soviet Union squared off against each other. The Cold War was a period of philosophical or ideological conflict. The United States was promoting democratic capitalism. The Soviet Union was promoting one-party communist socialism. And each one thought that it had the answer to the world's problems. Each one thought that its system was the model for the world. So the United States wanted to spread capitalism and democracy, and the Soviet Union wanted to spread communism. And so it was really hard for people in those two countries, and the two countries acting as countries, to accept the legitimacy of the other. Each one looked on the other one as illegitimate. And Americans often spoke of the Soviets as godless communists, officially atheistic, so godless. And the Soviets and the communists looked upon Americans as these capitalist imperialists and militarists who were trying to take over the world. So there was this ongoing tension. But in addition, these two countries were the most powerful countries in the world militarily. They had the biggest military establishments, which meant that if the difference of opinion, if the difference of philosophy and ideology gave rise to a military clash, then it was going to be a horrible one. So that's what the Cold War was. And it ended only with the dissolution of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s. The Soviet Union just voted itself out of existence, and it fell into 15 separate pieces. So that's the Cold War. And if the question were posed to a political scientist and international relations theorist as to why no World War III, the most common answer would be because of the development of nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons. The United States acquired nuclear weapons in 1945 and used two of them. They were then called the atom bomb, used 2 atom bombs against Japan. And that brought the end of World War II in the Pacific. Those are the only 2 occasions on which nuclear weapons have been used in war. They've been tested lots of times, but they've never otherwise been used in war. The Soviet Union got its own atom bomb, its own nuclear weapons, in 1949. There was an arms race that set in thereupon, and the United States advanced from the first generation of nuclear weapons, fission weapons, to fusion weapons, sometimes called the hydrogen bomb, the H-bomb, or sometimes called thermonuclear weapons. The Soviet Union took 4 years to catch up to the United States in the first phase of the race. It only took about 1.5 years to catch up to the United States in the second phase of the race. So by the early 1950s, both sides had the H-bomb, hydrogen bombs. And these remain today state-of-the-art in nuclear weapons. Now, they've been miniaturized and they've been improved, but basically the explosive technology is the same. In the case of the fission bomb, you take basically two chunks of a very heavy radioactive substance like uranium, or it could be plutonium, and you smash them together and you create what's called critical mass. And the neutrons that are let off by the different atoms in the mass, they go and hit the other ones and they break them up and they break them up, and the result is that these heavy elements break down into lighter elements. But according to Einstein's equation of E equals mc squared, the mass of the result is somewhat less than the mass of the constituent parts, and the difference came off in energy, and the c squared makes sure that that energy is a really big number. So that's the fission weapon. The fusion weapon, the second generation, you take hydrogen and you smash hydrogen together and it fuses to make helium. And again, the mass of the result of helium is somewhat less than the mass of the constituent parts, and the difference in mass becomes energy, and you get this big boom. Anyway, the point of all of this is that nuclear weapons were and are so potentially destructive that no national leader in his or her right mind would ever launch a nuclear war. And so nuclear weapons, by being so horrible, basically became a force for peace, because neither side would risk using nuclear weapons, knowing that even the winner in a nuclear war would be so badly damaged that the war would have been worse than a waste of time. It would have been nearly and maybe completely national suicide. So nuclear weapons are the reason why no World War III, according to this scenario. But there's some problems with this scenario. One is the fundamental one that I just alluded to, where I said that no national leader in his or her right mind would ever use them. Well, the thing is that history has demonstrated that national leaders are not always in what most people call their right minds. And there have been individuals who probably would have been happy to use nuclear weapons had they had them. In fact, the principal spur to the American Manhattan Project, this was the atom bomb building project, top secret in World War II, was a fear on the part of the American government that Hitler and German scientists were developing an atom bomb. And the feeling was, if they get it first, Hitler's going to use it. And maybe the only thing that would keep him from using it is a knowledge that we might use it, or maybe we'll get the bomb and use it first against him. Now, in fact, the American Manhattan Project did not come to fruition, did not actually produce a bomb while Hitler was still alive. The war in Europe ended in May 1945, and Hitler killed himself. So, and the atom bomb project wasn't finished. The first atom bomb wasn't tested until July, so a few months later. And then it was, very quickly, used against the Japanese. Would the United States have used an atom bomb against Hitler? It's hard, I mean, nobody knows. They didn't have the bomb, so we don't know. But in any event, so this idea that nuclear weapons have been a force for peace and stability because they're so horrible, it does depend on national leaders being rational, being sane, and not just saying, I mean, if Hitler, for example, had had nuclear weapons when American and Russian and British and French armies were converging on Berlin, he might very well have said, okay, if I'm going down, I'm taking Europe down with me, and launched his nuclear weapons. And Germany might still have lost, but he might have destroyed Paris and London and Moscow. But he didn't have them. So, but anyway, so it does depend on rationality. And also, it's not simply rationality, because during the Cold War, there developed entire schools of thought about how you would reason your way to the use of nuclear weapons. The United States relied on nuclear weapons more than the Soviet Union did in the following sense: that the Soviet Union, for most of the Cold War, had a very large conventional army. So they had lots of tanks and lots of troops under arms. The United States had a much smaller conventional army and fewer tanks and all that sort of thing, relying more on nuclear weapons to deter, that was an important word in the Cold War in this context, to deter the Soviets from attacking. So the understanding was that if the Soviets decided to launch an invasion of Western Europe, they could have done it because there weren't enough American conventional forces and other NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, there weren't enough troops to stop them. But they wouldn't do it because the United States had nuclear weapons. And the Russians had to suspect that the United States would use the nuclear weapons in response to this kind of attack. So, but it all depends on a careful calculation. So, do they think we'll use them? There were some close calls. The closest call was the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, where Nikita Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union, placed nuclear missiles in Cuba with the idea that they would be sort of right over the shoulder of American leaders in Washington, very much closer than the nuclear missiles that the Russians had in the Soviet Union. And John Kennedy, the American president at the time, decided that this was unacceptable. And so he issued an ultimatum to Khrushchev. He said, get those missiles out of Cuba or else. Now, he didn't exactly say what else meant, but he made it very clear that the United States considers these weapons in Cuba to be a very dire threat. He went on to say, Kennedy went on to say, and this is the only time an American president has ever directly and openly issued a threat of nuclear war. What he said was, if those missiles are used against the United States, missiles from Cuba will be interpreted as missiles from the Soviet Union, and any launch will be met with America's full retaliatory response. And so this means we're going to wipe you out with our nuclear weapons. Now, Khrushchev, for political reasons of his own, also because the United States actually had more nuclear weapons than the Russians did at the time, backed down. And the missiles got out of Cuba. There was a backroom deal where some American missiles in Turkey were removed from Turkey, which is right next door to the Soviet Union. Anyway, so it didn't happen, but it might have. And people who were close to Kennedy said, you know, if things had gone just a little bit differently, the world might have actually gone to nuclear war. And so, and both Kennedy and Khrushchev were rational. And so maybe it's not, you don't have to be a madman to use nuclear weapons. You just have to see things differently than the other side. The other problem with nukes preventing World War III from happening is that it's not just the United States and the Soviet Union, and now the successor of the Soviet Union, Russia, that have nuclear weapons. There are a bunch of other states that now have nuclear weapons. And they'd be tempted to use them. So the Chinese have nuclear weapons, and the French, and the British, and the North Korea is the latest, India, Pakistan. So there are a bunch of Israel presumably has nuclear weapons, although it doesn't boast of the fact. It lets the enemies are in the neighborhood know that they're there, but it doesn't formally say we've got the weapons. But anyway, so these other countries, you multiply the number of peoples with fingers on the nuclear trigger, and you multiply the number of possibilities that things could go wrong. So maybe it is the existence of nuclear weapons that has prevented World War III. But we can't be sure. And in fact, since we don't know, well, then Americans and other people in countries that have nuclear weapons have to make a basic decision. If nuclear weapons are what prevented World War III, then the policy that should follow from that is hang on to the nuclear weapons, keep your nuclear deterrent robust, and let the world know that you're still going to use them if anybody else uses them. So, if you think it's the existence of nuclear weapons that prevented World War III, then the policy that follows from that is keep your nuclear weapons. On the other hand, if something else prevented World War III, maybe that humans had become more peaceful or for other reasons, if World War III just wasn't in the books and it wasn't nuclear weapons that prevented World War III, then the policy that should follow from that is just the opposite. Nuclear weapons are this horrible accident waiting to happen. And we've been lucky that the accident hasn't happened in the last 75 years, but we're not going to be lucky forever. So the policy that would follow from the conclusion that it wasn't nuclear weapons that prevented World War III would be get rid of those nukes before they go off and hundreds of millions of people get killed. So, if not nuclear weapons, and maybe not just a change in human nature that prevented World War III, well, what else might have prevented World War III? Well, something that is often overlooked, I think, and it's maybe especially unappreciated lately, is America's role in promoting free trade. So the United States made a fundamental decision, basically a basic change in its policy for the previous century, that the United States was going to promote free trade. And this came at a time in 1945 when the United States dominated the world economy. And the United States was in a position at that time, because it dominated the world economy, to basically dictate the rules for the rest of the world economy. And the United States could have said, okay, we're going to protect our advantage to the detriment of everybody else. But American leaders didn't. And they didn't because they believed, well, first of all, that free trade was a good thing. If each country and people in each country specialize in what they're really good at, then the world as a whole is better off. But they also recognized that the trade wars, which is the opposite of free trade, the trade wars of the 1930s, where each country levied tariffs against other countries and there became this trade war, was one of the things that led to the real war of World War II. And so Americans concluded that free trade was conducive to peace. And so America opened its markets to foreign trade and basically insisted that other countries open their markets to foreign trade. The Soviet bloc, the Communist Empire, didn't participate, but other countries did. And free trade spread around the world, with the consequence that competition was channeled away from military affairs into economic affairs. And the world got a whole lot richer. The overall standard of living in the world improved dramatically in the period after 1945. But more important than that, nations of the world began to look on each other as partners rather than rivals or enemies. France and Germany, which had gone to war lots of times in the past, but especially in World War I and World War II again, became each other's best partners, best trading partners. And so free trade is this thing that is, well, it succeeded It succeeded dramatically. One of the things it succeeded in doing, perhaps, was preventing World War III. Now, it succeeded so well that it came to be taken for granted. And since Donald Trump became president, free trade has been under serious attack. In fact, President Trump threw American policy back to the 1930s by launching a trade war against China and using tariffs against other countries as well. So we might be in a position to sort of put this free trade theory of why World War III to the test. The United States has begun to treat China as its enemy, and China looking upon the United States as an enemy. These are the two great powers of the world today. Will this lead to a war between China and the United States? Will this be a World War III? We certainly hope not, but no one can tell.